I was pleased to see that the topics that came up landed in the same buckets of our conversation that we had in Durban around the informal settlement, informal economy, the papers that we wrote together. I think there's a lot of hope for having a common agenda as we move forward. What I thought was really interesting is we started our conversation in Durban talking about changing the narrative. And I think what's different in this conversation is maybe a call for a bigger narrative. And so there is now where we saw informal settlements and formal housing and formal infrastructure as being precarious. Actually, now all of that is precarious for all of us, especially when you think about what we heard today, how many people in the informal sector there are who have businesses, but how many people who live in informal settlements actually drive the infrastructure of the formal sector in the city. I know that in many cities in the US, 25% of the population is still at work, even though we are supposed to be sheltering in place. Well, much of that 25% are not doctors and nurses. They're people of very low income wages who drive the infrastructure, and that's true globally. One of the respondents talked about settlements, economy, and transport being three main issues, and those were certainly true in our paper, and I think are highlighted in this time of COVID. So I would say so one would be this idea of precariousness is both heightened, but actually now we see that the precariousness of low-income households and families drives a more precarious city. So that's part of the bigger narrative. Human rights was the second thing that I think we talked a lot about over time. And what I really liked about this conversation is talking about human rights from a pragmatic approach, from inclusive communities, equitable cities. And it's not surprising because mayors we talk about them being the first line responders. One of the respondents talked about investing in the future. So we need to have COVID responses that invest in the future. Well, that's more than a human rights approach, that's a pragmatic approach. And I think those are the kind of approaches that we were described today. The third one I would say is this idea of the local government units being the first responders. And we always say that, and that's true. It's not the national government's local responders. But I think what came out clearly in the presentations today, if the local government units are the first responders, the organized local community, grassroots communities are the hands and feet of those first responders. And it's important for us to realize that in times of COVID, I think what we see is we talk about informal settlements and economies being invisible. Clearly, with the lack of infrastructure for the formal economy, we can see that their outputs are not invisible. So that's, I think, been heightened. I love the making your cities work conversations. I love the self-organizing conversations that Jane and others talked about. The need for data and mapping is being critical. It's critical for a bigger narrative, but also critical for making science-based, evidence-based solutions. Those were across all of them. I would just point out a couple of things before I close. One would be, we talk about policy coherence. Several of responders talked about protocol coherence. So it's not enough to have policy. Pragmatically, we have to have the national government, the city government, the communities actually aligned in the way that we respond to a disaster. And this is a disaster. I like the notion of shared accountability, national to city, but I would say if we were going to include informal settlements, there's a shared accountability, national to cities, to the informal settlements. They really should be part of the conversation. And I guess I would just close in saying sometimes at Habitat for Humanity, we talk about the importance of P4, people, public, private partnership. We often talk about those private partnership, people, public, private partnerships being a project. But I think what we're seeing now is it's really the way our cities should work every day in every way. If we're to have the horizontal collaboration that we talked about in the paper and in Durban, and that came up in several of the conversations, that horizontal collaboration rests on full collaboration by all of the people in the city. I like the notion of that collaboration driving inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable cities that we all search for. And I would say that we should not waste a crisis, as people say. Let's see this crisis as an opportunity, not just to change a narrative, but create a bigger narrative about how informal settlements and informal economies don't just drive those with low incomes, but they actually drive the formal and support the formal sector to create these resilient cities that we hope for. So those are some of the main themes that I saw, and it was really a great conversation.